The night was full of excitement in Paris. The cool September air carried the sweet smell of fresh flowers placed around the grand entrance of the Palais de Tokyo. This was where one of the biggest fashion shows of the season was about to take place. Outside, a long red carpet stretched under bright lights. It looked shiny and smooth, reflecting the flashes of cameras. Photographers stood on both sides, snapping pictures of every famous person walking in. Celebrities, models, and designers arrived one by one, each dressed in stunning outfits. But among them, one person stood out, not because of bright colors or glittering jewelry, but because of her simple and graceful presence. Sandra Bullock, the famous Hollywood actress, walked down the carpet. She moved with natural elegance, as if time had no effect on her. She wore a long beige dress, simple but beautiful, fitting her perfectly. While most people wore bold, dramatic outfits, her dress was quiet and classy. She always believed that true beauty didn't have to be loud. The moment she arrived, the photographers called her name. "Sandra, over here." Flashes went off even faster as she smiled warmly and waved. She didn't pose too much or try too hard, just a gentle, kind smile. Her makeup was light and natural. Her soft brown hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders. Some people watching might have thought her outfit was too plain for such a fancy event. But others saw something different. They saw someone who didn't need to scream for attention. Someone real. At the entrance, event staff welcomed her with friendly smiles. She was given a special seat in the front row, a place only for the most important guests. She nodded in thanks and made her way to her chair, feeling the eyes of many people on her. Some watched with admiration, others with quiet judgment. As she settled into her seat, two young women entered the same row. They were social media influencers, famous online not for movies but for their posts, pictures, and fashion opinions. They wore eye-catching gowns covered in sparkles. Their makeup was thick and perfect, their hairstyle just right. They whispered to each other, giggling as they looked around. "Wait, is that Sandra Bullock?" one of them asked. She didn't even try to lower her voice. "Yeah. I thought she would look more amazing," the other replied, tilting her head. "That dress beige? Seriously?" She giggled again. Sandra heard them. She kept her eyes on the empty runway, pretending not to notice. She had been in Hollywood long enough to hear things like this before. Fame could be a cruel place and the fashion world could be even worse. But still, their words stung a little. "She was really big in the 90s, the first influencer whispered, her voice fake sweet. "But I guess her time is over, don't you think?" The other girl smirked. "Yeah. And who even wears something like that to an event like this?" Sandra took a deep breath. Her heartbeat stayed steady. Her face didn't flush with embarrassment. She had been through worse in her life. But no matter how strong someone is, words like that have a way of staying in the air, like invisible poison. Then suddenly a voice spoke from behind them. It was quiet but strong. Sandra sensed it before she even turned her head. The influencers, however, were completely unaware. They had no idea they had just been overheard by the wrong person. The lights in the hall began to dim. The murmurs of the guests softened as the show was about to begin. A large screen at the end of the runway lit up, showing the first glimpses of the designer's new collection. Soft music filled the room. Sandra remained still, keeping her usual calm expression. She loved fashion, not just as something pretty but as an art form. To her, every dress, every fabric, every tiny stitch was a piece of a story told by the designer. The first model stepped onto the runway. She wore a structured, bold outfit, walking with perfect posture. Cameras flashed in unison. People clapped, their applause polite but growing with each new design revealed. Sandra watched closely, studying the details of every outfit. The way the fabric moved, the creative color choices, the way designers played with texture and style. She clapped respectfully, truly appreciating the art of it all. But the two influencers beside her? They had different thoughts. "Oh no, that's too much," one of them muttered as a model walked out in a voluminous, flowy gown. "I would never wear that," the other scoffed. "It looks like my grandma's curtains." They giggled under their breath. Sandra ignored them. Fashion was about personal taste. Some people loved wild, dramatic outfits. Others liked simple, classic styles. That was fine. But the way these girls were laughing at everything, making fun of people's hard work, it wasn't just about opinions. It was about putting others down. Then one of them whispered, "But nothing tops the look sitting right next to us." The other chuckled, looking Sandra up and down. "I know, right? It's like she tried to be elegant, but picked the wrong decade." Sandra stayed calm. She had learned long ago not to let words control her emotions. But this time, something about it felt personal. She took a slow, steady breath. She tried to focus on the runway again, on the beautiful outfits, on the art. But the words had already crept in, like tiny thorns in her mind. In today's world, comments like these wouldn't just stay in this room. Within hours, they could be online. Millions of people could see them. Millions could share them. And that thought, knowing how fast and cruel the internet could be, made her feel just a little more alone, even in the middle of a crowded room. Then one of the influencers went too far. "It's kinda sad, isn't it?" she whispered. She used to be a huge star. Now she's just another woman trying to stay relevant. This time Sandra felt it. Because deep down, that was a fear that haunted so many women. The fear of becoming invisible. The idea that after a certain age, women stop being noticed, stop being valued. That no matter how talented, strong, or successful they were, they would slowly start to fade away. She blinked slowly. She didn't want them to see that their words had affected her. But something inside her shifted. For a moment she thought about speaking up. Not to defend herself, but to challenge this shallow, cruel way of thinking. But before she could decide, something unexpected happened. A sound. Someone behind them cleared their throat. It was quiet, but it carried weight. The influencers froze. Sandra felt it too. Someone had been sitting behind them the whole time, listening to everything. And now that person was about to speak. The runway lights continued to shine, casting a soft, golden glow over the models as they walked. But in the front row, something even more important was happening. Sandra felt it, the shift in the air. It was subtle, but it was powerful. The silence wasn't normal anymore. It was heavy. The influencers hadn't turned around yet. They didn't know who had made the sound. But Sandra already knew. She didn't need to look to recognize that kind of presence. There were only a few people in the world who had it. Slowly, she glanced over her shoulder. Keanu Reeves, sitting directly behind them. He wore a sleek black suit, a crisp white shirt with no tie. His dark hair was slightly messy, like he had casually run his fingers through it. Keanu never tried to get attention. But somehow he always had it anyway. His face was calm. His body language was relaxed. But his eyes, his deep, steady eyes, held something different. A quiet power. A firm understanding. And the influencers? They were about to realize they had made a very big mistake. Keanu wasn't the kind of man who needed to shout to make people listen. He didn't have to. Just one word was enough. Funny. The word hung in the air. One of the girls, an influencer, let out a nervous laugh. "Oh, hi," she said, turning around with an unsure smile, hoping Keanu hadn't heard what they were saying. But he had. He always did. Keanu tilted his head and watched them for a moment, just a little longer than was comfortable. Then, in a calm voice, so calm it was almost scarier than anger, he asked, "What exactly did you find so funny?" This time no one answered right away. The other influencer shifted in her seat, trying to think of something to say. The fashion show was still happening, but now people weren't watching the models. They were watching Keanu. One of the influencers, still forcing a smile, tried to brush it off. "Oh, nothing really. Just talking about fashion. You know, lots of opinions at these events." Keanu's lips curved slightly, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "I see," he said. "But I don't think you were talking about fashion." His voice was steady, but his words were heavy, impossible to ignore. "You were talking about a person." The air changed. The first influencer opened her mouth to argue, but Keanu lifted a single finger. Just a tiny movement, but it said, "Don't bother." "And you were wrong." Sandra sat still, watching. She had spent years ignoring mean comments. She had learned to pretend they didn't hurt. But now, watching Keanu stand up for her so effortlessly, something inside her changed. For the first time in a long time, she didn't have to defend herself. Because someone else was doing it for her. And not just anyone. Keanu. The influencers were nervous now. The younger one fidgeted with her hands, picking at her rings. Now she was the one feeling uncomfortable. The other one laughed again, but it was weaker this time. "Oh, we didn't mean anything bad. It was just a joke." Keanu tilted his head, thinking. A joke. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp. Interesting. Because it didn't sound funny. No one answered. A few whispers spread through the front row. People had noticed. Sandra felt the quiet stares of stylists, editors, and celebrities. They all understood what was happening. And Keanu knew it. He wasn't the kind of person to start drama. But he was the kind of person who spoke up when something was wrong. Sandra knew he hadn't done this just for her. He had done it because it was right. And that meant more than she could say. She turned her gaze back to the runway, needing a moment to steady herself. Then she felt something. When she looked back at Keanu, he wasn't looking at the influencers anymore. He was looking at her. And then something rare happened. Keanu Reeves smiled. Not a small polite smile. Not a fake smile. A real smile. Warm. Kind. Understanding. His eyes seemed to ask, "Are you okay?" Sandra blinked, then smiled back. "Yes, now I am." And just like that, as if nothing had happened, Keanu leaned back in his chair, relaxed once more. But the damage was already done. The influencers sat stiffly in their seats, their confidence gone. Now they were the ones who didn't belong. And Sandra? For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel invisible anymore. The room was still quiet. Not just awkwardly quiet, but something deeper. A shift. The models kept walking. The fashion show continued. But for many in the audience, the real show had already happened. The influencers sat frozen. Their smug expressions were gone. Their easy arrogance had disappeared. For the first time, they weren't the ones in control. And they knew it. Sandra, meanwhile, felt different. For years, she had taught herself to ignore moments like this. She had learned to stay quiet. She had accepted that in this industry, women were treated as if they didn't matter after a certain age. But now, something inside her told her she didn't have to accept it anymore. Keanu hadn't shouted. He hadn't argued. All he had done was speak the truth. And now these women were feeling the weight of their own words. The younger influencer tried to act normal. She pulled out her phone, pretending to be busy. The other leaned over to whisper something, but people were still watching. Then, from a few seats away, a well-known magazine editor, an older man with silver hair and a perfect suit, let out a quiet HM and gave Sandra a small, knowing smile. It was subtle, but it was support. And others noticed. A few women in the audience exchanged glances. Some nodded slightly. Sandra felt it. What Keanu had done wasn't just about this moment. It was bigger than that. People were tired of this kind of behavior. And the influencers? They felt it too. They weren't stupid. They knew their reputations were at risk. The older one, the leader, decided to take control. She forced a laugh loud enough for people to hear. "Wow, people take things way too seriously, huh?" Silence. She flipped her hair back and tried again. It was just a silly comment. No need for this whole vibe. She glanced at Keanu, hoping he'd agree. But he stayed silent. His face was neutral. And that silence was worse than any response. The other influencer, realizing they had to fix this, turned to Sandra with a bright, fake smile. "Oh, Sandra, we love you. Seriously. You're an icon. It was just a joke. I hope you didn't take it the wrong way." Sandra blinked slowly. She saw it for what it was. An attempt to erase what had just happened. An attempt to pretend it was nothing. But the audience wasn't stupid. Keanu didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Now the choice was Sandra's. And for the first time in a long time, she chose not to stay quiet. She turned to the two women. She smiled faintly. But it wasn't a friendly smile. Then, in a voice calm and sharp, she said, "Funny. Because it didn't sound like a joke." The exact words Keanu had used earlier. The influencers froze. Sandra turned back to Keanu. He was already looking at her. This time he didn't smile. But his eyes said everything. A quiet message. "I knew you had this in you." And for the first time in ages, Sandra felt something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. The show ended. Guests stood up, chatting about the designs. But some were still talking about what had happened in the front row. The influencers? They left quickly. Sandra stood up slowly, picking up her clutch without rushing. She had all the time in the world. Then a familiar voice called her name. "Sandra, a moment?" She turned. A well-known journalist. Sure. Respected. Always chasing a meaningful story. The journalist smiled. "I really want to talk to you about this. About how women in this industry are treated." "About?" Sandra paused for a moment, thinking. But then, something inside her told her it was time to speak. She nodded. "I think this is an important conversation," she said. The journalist smiled, excited. "Great. Because I think the world needs to hear it." As Sandra left the event and walked toward the interview, her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen and read the message. "Good answer. See you at the premiere." "Okay." Sandra smirked, feeling a little proud. Then she kept walking, not looking back. Suddenly she felt something, a change in the air. First she heard whispers. "Is that her? I can't believe she's here." It had been years since Sandra had been at an event like this. Then she noticed a familiar scent, soft jasmine, a little musk, and a tiny hint of vanilla. Slowly she turned around. And there she was. A woman who looked like she had stepped out of history. Her silver hair shimmered under the lights. She stood tall, calm, and powerful. It was Coco Chanel. Yes, the Coco Chanel, the woman who changed fashion forever. Even after all these years, her name still mattered. And now she was walking straight towards Sandra. The whole room went silent. The influencers, the ones who had laughed at Sandra earlier, stared in shock. They knew something big was about to happen. Sandra stood up, not sure what to expect. But Coco? Coco knew exactly what she was doing. She walked right up to Sandra, took her hands and held them gently. The room was completely still. Then Coco smiled. "My dear," she said, "you remind me of what true elegance is." Sandra felt those words hit her like a wave. They weren't just nice words. They meant something deep. The woman who defined elegance was telling Sandra that she had it too. Nothing could be bigger than that. The whispers started again, but this time they weren't gossip. They were in admiration. A famous fashion editor leaned over to someone and whispered, "She was just endorsed by Coco Chanel." This is history. The influencers sat frozen. They had lost. Because in the fashion world, no one was more powerful than Coco Chanel. And Coco had chosen Sandra. Sandra took a deep breath and smiled humbly. "That means a lot to me." Coco squeezed Sandra's hands and spoke words that would be remembered forever. "Elegance isn't about being noticed. It's about being remembered." Sandra felt chills. Suddenly, everything made sense. It wasn't about being loud. It wasn't about trying to make people look at you. It was about being timeless. Just like Coco. And now, just like Sandra. The influencers sat stiffly in their seats. There was no way to undo what had happened. They had tried to make Sandra look small. But now, she had become something greater. And them? They had become irrelevant. Sandra felt a gaze on her. She looked up. Keanu was still there. And he wasn't surprised. It was like he had known all along that this moment was meant to happen. Maybe he had, because Keanu always saw beyond the surface. His expression was clear. "I knew you had this in you." Sandra felt warmth fill her chest. For the first time in a long time, she believed it too. She smiled at him. "And Keanu?" He smiled back. Coco took a small step back, but her presence still filled the room. She looked around, her eyes scanning the crowd. Then, with a wise, knowing look, she said, "Fashion changes. But style? Style is forever." Then she looked at Sandra and said one final thing. "And you, my dear, are eternal." The entire room erupted into applause. There was no doubt anymore. Sandra didn't need to fight for respect. She had it. She didn't just win the night. She became a part of history. As Sandra's phone buzzed, she glanced at the screen. Another message. "You never had to prove anything to anyone. But it was beautiful to watch." "Okay." She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. Then, without looking back, she walked forward. The event was still buzzing with conversation. But no one was talking about the fashion show anymore. They were talking about Sandra. She hadn't just been defended by Keanu Reeves. She had been endorsed by Coco Chanel. What started as an ordinary evening had turned into a historic moment. The influencers? They had disappeared into the crowd. Their voices? Now silent. Sandra, on the other hand, was at the center of everything. As she moved through the room, people admired her. They whispered about her. A journalist approached her, Clara Bennett, a famous reporter known for always getting the best stories. "Sandra, a moment?" Sandra recognized her instantly. She nodded with grace. They stepped into a quieter corner of the venue. Clara pressed record. "What happened here tonight was unexpected, wasn't it?" Clara asked with a small smile. Sandra gave her own knowing smile. She thought for a second before answering. "I'd say it was inevitable." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Inevitable? What do you mean?" Sandra took a deep breath. "I've been through moments like this before," she explained. "The fashion and entertainment industries always act like women have an expiration date. Like we always have to change to stay relevant. I got used to being judged. But today..." She smiled. "Today was different." Clara leaned in, intrigued. "Because Keanu Reeves stood up for you?" Sandra shook her head. "No. Because I decided not to let it slide." Clara quickly jotted something down in her notebook. "Do you think this moment will change things in the industry?" she asked. Sandra took a thoughtful pause. Then she said something powerful. "Change is already happening. What happened tonight wasn't just about me. It was about every woman who has ever been ignored or laughed at just for getting older. For not trying to be loud. For just being herself." Camera flashes flickered as Sandra stepped out of the event. But this time, she wasn't just another face in the crowd. She had become a statement. The moment between her, Keanu, and Coco Chanel was already going viral. People weren't just talking about fashion anymore. They were talking about authenticity, about respect, about the kind of elegance that doesn't fade. And for the first time in a long time, Sandra didn't feel like she was trying to hold on to relevance. She was defining it. By morning, everything had changed. Luxury brands were rethinking their campaigns. Industry leaders were speaking out. The world was choosing a new idea of beauty, one that didn't fade with time. And the influencers? Silent. That afternoon, an email arrived. The Paris Fashion Council wanted Sandra to give a keynote speech on timeless elegance and authenticity. For the first time ever, she wasn't just a guest at the table. She was the one setting it. As she stood by her window looking out at the city, she realized something. Elegance isn't about the dress you wear. It's about the confidence with which you wear yourself. True beauty doesn't fade. It deepens. It strengthens. It becomes unshakable. And Sandra? She had never felt more powerful. Because real elegance isn't about being remembered for a moment. It's about being unforgettable. If you enjoyed this story, share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories filled with adventure, mystery, and excitement. Your support means the world, and it helps keep these stories coming. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.